My name is George Sabanko. I'm a professor of engineering here, and it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Arun Ross from Michigan State University. Professor Ross was an undergraduate at the Birla Institute of Science and Technology in Pilani, a very famous and illustrious school in India, and then did his master's and PhD work at Michigan State. He went to West Virginia for about 10 years, where he started up a center, and then returned in 2012, 13, to Michigan State, where he leads really a world-class group of faculty and graduate program in biometrics and pattern recognition. If you look at his Google Scholar page, you'll see he's written some of the most influential books and articles in the subject. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce him, and let's welcome him.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, George, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to speak. I've titled the talk as Biometrics Under Attack. I'll talk a little bit about the technology first, the science first, behind this concept of biometrics. But I'd also like to highlight some of the various ways in which this technology is under attack. And I leave that as a suspense as to what that entails. But hopefully, besides me just lecturing, hopefully there is some feedback so we can have a fruitful, interactive, productive, controversial discussion on this topic. I come from the iProbe lab. I direct the iProbe lab. We have currently 7 PhD students, 1 postdoc, a bunch of undergraduate students. And I primarily worked in the past with master's thesis students. And now increasingly I'm working with PhD students. We have the social media presence. There is a Twitter account that we tweet from and keep the community updated with some of the work that we're doing, whether they are interested or not. There are things that I'll be saying today that are based on some of these resources that we have had the opportunity to co-author in the past. One is the Introduction to Biometrics. It's a textbook that we use for undergraduate students. But there's also a monograph titled Handbook of Multi-Biometrics, which talks about fusion. And since fusion is an exciting topic and relevant to fields beyond biometrics, I will be alluding to some of those concepts in this talk. The 4 related resources that will in some sense reflect some of the philosophical aspects of today's discussion, as well as the technological aspects of today's discussion, are listed here. The first one, which kind of tries to summarize the research done in this field over 50 years, is what is listed as the first bullet point. The second bullet point goes into the territory of privacy of the technology. It's titled, What Else Does Your Biometric Data Reveal? Something that we will be seeing in this lecture. We also have this third bullet point here, which says bridging the gap from biometrics to forensics. Because as it is, the field of forensics is related to biometrics, and there is a gap between the two communities that has been created for historical reasons. But nevertheless, there are some good merits why these two fields have to communicate. And so that's a reflection of that thought that is indicated in that third bullet point, bridging the gap from biometrics to forensics. The last resource here is titled Guidelines for Best Practices in Biometrics Research. And the primary focus of that particular article is to indicate to the research community the importance of making their algorithms, their findings, their research itself relevant in many cases to the operational demands of the system. Because there are many developments going on in the operational domain that can benefit from what the researchers are doing in the lab, but how do we translate this research into something that merits observation by the operationally inclined researcher? So we try to offer some best practices to maximize biometrics research. Again, these are personal perspectives reflecting our personal opinions. The research theme of our lab is often difficult to kind of summarize it because there are students working on so many different topics. But if someone were to really push us hard and say, well, can you summarize the research work that is going on in the lab? I would say that these are the three current research activities that we're engaged in. First one we call as adversarial biometric recognition, and I'll talk about much of this in the lecture. The second one is what we call as forensics and privacy. And the third one is biometric fusion. And all these three different topics are based on several principles that we glean from computer vision, machine learning, pattern recognition, data mining, and so on and so forth. And so much of our contribution in these three arenas are reflected more in the computer vision and pattern recognition communities, and to some extent in the machine learning community. So let's start with this, where's Waldo? Right? I think at some point in time we have played this game. Anyone still playing this? It's just only me? Okay, all right. At least one hand is up, it's mine. And a series of children's book created by the British illustrator Martin Handford. Illustration of a large number of people who are engaged in various activities, and the readers are challenged to find a character named Waldo, who is now described in terms of a picture on the right of this view graph. And so we take in this picture, and then we encounter an image seen like this, and now the question is, where's Waldo? That is really a question that I'm asking you right now, where is Waldo? And the good thing is you can point anywhere, and I can say it's right because I don't know where you're pointing to. And so you are right. But if you were to, and maybe some of you discovered this, there is Waldo. Clearly you're disadvantaged because you can look at these illustrations much more closely than in the screen. But there's Waldo. And the point I'm trying to make is there is a description of a person that you have in your mind, and then somehow you're invoking that description to locate this individual in what we would call is a distracting scene. There are distractors that are deliberately positioned in some cases in order to make it difficult for you to find the character, which is what makes this a very exciting game, at least for me. And so we see this challenge being that of determining the location of a person whose identity is known, but whose appearance in this particular image, the image that you see here, may not be in its full form. There are portions of Waldo that are not observable, and there are confounding factors that can lead your eye to look at some other aspects of the picture, and so on and so forth. And clearly, although it's the same character, as you move from one illustration to the other, the nature of the challenge becomes different. And so there's Waldo somewhere there, and we can keep playing this all day, and I'll be done with my lecture. But that's not what the purpose is. The purpose is to point out, as we say in this next slide, that as you start adding other characters into the mix, many of whom might look like Waldo, or which can cause the human mind to be confounded, the problem becomes difficult. Now, to be sure, this is not necessarily a person recognition problem in the sense of biometrics, whose definition I'll provide in a few seconds. Because this entails the use of the human mind, and so we're really talking about perceptual human recognition, on how humans can recognize each other. And that is separate from how machines recognize humans. So those two have to be separated. But this is just to point out that even humans can have a hard time recognizing individuals whose descriptions they are well aware of, and in some cases are provided through a series of illustrations so you know who you're looking for, but it does become increasingly hard in scenarios like the ones that I referred to earlier, and further confounded when you have characters like Odlaw, Wilma, Wenda, Wolf, etc., who might confound the scene. So what did we learn from here? So who is Waldo? Well, he's defined by facial appearance, clothing, and accessories. But he can be occluded. There is a challenging environment, different types of environment to begin with, large number of people. You have some people who look similar, doppelgangers, and you have people engaged in diverse activities, the illumination changes, pose of Waldo changes, and so on and so forth. It's a challenging problem because you're not just looking for Waldo, you're looking for Waldo in the midst of this commotion. But again, just to summarize that, this still entails the use of the human mind in order to recognize an individual. So that is not what biometrics is. So I actually spent quite a number of slides indicating what biometrics is not. Because that is very important in our discussion moving forward, because biometrics is the use of automated schemes for recognizing individuals, and those automated schemes may or may not be informed by human understanding of the problem. And that is a big distinction between where is Waldo and where is this person with respect to a computer algorithm. And we will expound on these thoughts a bit more as we move into these other slides. So what is biometrics? Well, let's have a working definition. Because if we go into the ISO, IEC definitions, too formal, very interesting, very complete, very precise, but maybe working definitions are fun to work with, which is why they call us working definitions. So it's the automated recognition of individuals based on their biological and behavioral characteristics. That's what biometrics is. And I'm using biometrics as a term, and that's why I said biometrics is. It's singular, but I could have said biometrics are, which is also correct. And so I'll use both these qualifications depending upon the context. Now, traits from which distinguishing repeatable features can be extracted. The second bullet point is extremely important in our understanding of biometrics, because it says and demands that you want to extract traits which are distinguishing, the ability to distinguish between individuals. That's an important attribute of a biometric trait, because if we have a trait that looks similar across the population, that would fail that definition. Secondly, we need something which is repeatable. Because if you had a trait that changed every 5 seconds, or every 5 minutes, or every 5 days, then really that would not qualify as a biometric trait, because every time you measure that, you're not getting the same signal from that body trait. Now, why am I reiterating this particular point, that you need to have distinguishing and repeatable features in order to qualify something as a biometric trait? Because these two attributes are the most fundamental attributes of a biometric trait, namely distinctiveness and permanence. Distinctiveness ensures that we can distinguish between individuals via that trait, and permanence indicates that if we were to measure the same trait of the same person over multiple time slices, we get a similar response. Uniqueness and permanence, or distinctiveness and permanence. But surprisingly, in the biometrics community, if you were to take a trait such as fingerprint, which is a legitimate biometric trait, and if you were to ask a room of experts, what is the degree of distinctiveness or uniqueness, and what is the degree of permanence of a biometric trait with respect to this automated scheme of things, you will get 50 different responses in a room of 25. And that is because these two numbers, which we deem to be fundamental in our understanding of biometric traits, have not been reliably computed and assimilated by the research community. So if someone here is doing a PhD on this topic of saying, I want to determine the degree of distinctiveness and the degree of permanence of a biometric trait, that's a great problem to work on. It entails clearly an understanding of the biology of the trait, but that's where it begins. But you also have to have all these statistical models in place and a good understanding of information theory, of course. And when you bring all these to bear, you then discover that you need large amounts of data in order to either substantiate your assertion or even to begin making your computational models effective. And so there are all these barriers that prevent us from saying, without any ambiguity, what is the degree of distinctiveness or permanence of a biological trait? The image that you see on the right is called as the Berthian card. The Berthian card, named after a French researcher named Alphonse Berthian, who for good reason is often referred to as the father of modern biometrics. Because he asked a very interesting question. He said, can we come up with a scientifically sound scheme to recognize individuals? The word recognize is important because we will talk about this halfway through the lecture as to why the word recognition is important. But his question was, can we have a scientifically sound way of recognizing an individual besides saying, well, I think I know you and you're so-and-so. He said, can you come up with a scientifically sound way to do that? And the reason he posed that question, and there are diverse opinions as to why he posed the question, but the one that I am more prone to believing is the fact that at that point in time in French history, the law required that if a person was a repeat offender, that the degree of penalty that was meted was different than if this was a first-time offender. And so it was very important for the legal system to determine if a person had to receive a certain degree of punishment for a certain crime based on whether he or she had committed a crime before. So recognition became important because the person couldn't be brought into a police station and the captain looks at him and says, I think I saw you 5 years ago. You're a repeat offender. They needed a way to document this in a proper way. So what did Alphonse Bertien do? He said, well, let's come up with a method to measure various anthropometric attributes of the individual, namely sitting height, standing height, length of forearm, length of index finger, size of face, perimeter of face, circumference of face, width of shoulder, length of foot, etc. And document this in a card. And so the card that you see on the right, if you look very carefully at the top, you will see some numbers there. Those are the anthropometric attribute numbers that I just alluded to. And then there was a picture taken of the subject as well. And this was indexed and kept in a cabinet in that police station. So if a person were to walk in, then they would engage in this process again of measuring the person's biological attributes, anthropometric attributes, and then they would create a card, and now the police officer could wander into that room and locate the closest matching card because it was indexed based on those numbers that you see. And if he determined there was a match because those numbers are there, supplemented with the picture, then he would know that this is a repeat offender. But that was how biometrics began. Now, clearly, one could say that there were other things that happened before that which would constitute the term biometrics, but really, the focus here was on the scientific principle of recognizing individuals. It's a fascinating question. It's a fascinating question. How do you recognize an individual? If you look at the etymological basis of the word recognition, it is to recall, to bring to mind. That means you've already seen someone and you're just saying, do I recognize that person? So that's very important, that thought. This is how it was, an early biometric system. On the left, you see those pictures that are taken from the book by Rhodes, 1956. And you see an officer or an expert who's measuring the various attributes that I alluded to through a process, a very convoluted process. Because if the officer changed and someone else came and did the same measurements, you are likely to come up with different numbers. Not a perfect system, but it gave a deep understanding, or at least a good understanding, if not a deep understanding, of the importance of the identity question. How can we recognize individuals in a scientifically sound manner? Now, modern biometric matching is still wrestling with similar problems. So let's pose the problem. And for those who are statistically inclined, hopefully you'll appreciate the complexity of the problem. And others as well, because it is not a simple problem. It's a fascinating problem. So you're given two biometric samples, so two biological or behavioral traits that you have been able to measure. You're given two biometric samples, and you're asked to estimate two numbers. The first one is the likelihood that these two fingerprints are of the same person. Now you would say, well, that's all that we need to know, don't we? We just need to know the degree of similarity between these two fingerprints. If the similarity is high, then we would claim that these originated from the same finger. If the similarity is low, we would then claim that these originated from two different subjects, or two different fingers at the least. But it's not straightforward. Because as we know from the Neyman-Pearson criteria of statistical hypothesis testing, the likelihood ratio is important. We need the first number that says what is the likelihood that they are of the same person, but we also need to know the denominator, what is the likelihood that they are of different people, because we can't eliminate that hypothesis. For example, just because two face images look extremely alike, we can't dismiss the possibility that they belong to two different individuals because they might be twins. So in other words, two fingerprints might look exactly alike, but we want to know the denominator. What is the likelihood that they are still originating from two different people? The problem is the denominator is difficult to compute because we have not seen this fingerprint before. If we have, then we need to have multiple instances of that particular fingerprint, and hopefully in some parallel universe we do. But the fact of the matter, based on the data restriction that we have, and the fact that we may not have the fingerprints of every single person since Adam, we are now faced with this difficulty of computing the denominator, the likelihood that they are of different people. We need both these numbers. So let me give you an example. It could be that the degree of similarity between these two fingerprints is very high. Let's say 99% out of 100. So 99, just a raw number, 0.99 if you want to convert it into some normalized scale. But if fingerprints that look like this, if they had a higher chance of matching with someone else's fingerprint, then the denominator will be very high. And so you'll have 0.99 divided by, 1, right? Versus what is the likelihood that you see this fingerprint and the chances of it matching with someone else is very, very low. Guess what? Your likelihood ratio will explode because now you had the same 0.99 value, but its interpretation changed because you had some prior knowledge that fingerprints that look like this are more likely to match with someone else or not likely to match with someone else. The denominator is impossible to obtain using trivial means. This is what makes the problem very hard. Because as computer vision scientists, what we would say is tell me how similar they are. And in fact, we would go to the next level where we would try to do anything possible to make them match, while not giving sufficient allowance that this could be from two different fingerprints. Right? So biometric matching is not a simple problem, although in popular literature, and rightly so, there is a simple way of doing it. You just find the degree of similarity or dissimilarity between these two fingerprints. The same question can be asked of iris, and the same question can be asked of face as well. And this is where human-based face recognition is different from machine-based face recognition. For example, if I show you these two images, how many of you think that this is of the same individual? Okay, we have a couple people, 3 maybe. How many of you say this is of different people? Okay, quite a large number. Of course, I'm curious about those who did not raise their hands, but we won't get there. Right? Now, these are pictures of the same individual. Right? Now, for some who raise their hands, I suspect they know who this person is, and so they're familiar with the face, and so they have been able to extrapolate and say that this is of the same individual. Because you see, humans are very good at recognizing familiar faces. Right? That's something that cognitive psychology and neuroscience has taught us. Humans are good at recognizing familiar faces. The average human is good at recognizing familiar faces. There are some in our midst called as super recognizers. But the average person is good at recognizing familiar faces. But we're not good at recognizing unfamiliar faces. But here we're not talking about human-based face recognition. We're talking about machine-based face recognition. And we would like to know if machines, what would they think about these two subjects or these two images, and would they ascribe this to the same subject? So the question goes on. Biometric matching is a fascinating problem in itself. Although the problem statement is very simple, you just have to find out these two likelihoods and then take the ratio, but the denominator is not known, so you do this huge approximation and may I dare say an incorrect approximation, that the degree of similarity or dissimilarity is sufficient to suggest whether it originates from the same hand, from the same finger, from the same face, etc. And the question gets asked in many different contexts. Are these two prints from the same finger? If you look at the image on the left from the tragic incident that happened in Madrid, what is now known as the Madrid train bombings, and you have that fingerprint being lifted from a bag of explosives. That is the image that you would see in many criminal cases. And you have to match that image with the image on the right, which is a much clearer and cleaner image. But I think you would agree with me that even humans would find it difficult to match the image on the left with the image on the right. But in this case, they called it a match, which of course later was incorrect, what is known as the Mayfield case, which you can Google about later. But this also indicates to us the difficulty that a machine would encounter when trying to match the image on the left with the image on the right, because this is real-world examples. These are the types of images that can make or break many cases. And how do we deal reliably with these type of images? What kind of mathematical models can we develop in order to make this possible? These are important questions on how do you process poor quality samples. Or you can ask the question, are any of the Boston bombers in this scene? When law enforcement had to look through billions of images, perhaps, they had some understanding of who the subjects were, not with respect to their identity per se, but with respect to their face images. But how do they locate these two people of interest, not in a single image that you see on the right, but in billions of such images? Because you have to do face detection first, and once you detect the face, then you'll have to match that against the two faces that you see on the left. And the two faces on the left are not of high quality because they were gleaned from surveillance videos. So this poses, clearly, a very difficult and challenging problem because you're not dealing with these high-quality, high-resolution images for matching. In the real-world scenario, more often than not, especially in criminal investigations, you're dealing with images that are of inferior quality, while at the same time, the scale of the problem is immense. And you still want to use this technology to reliably recognize individuals. Very difficult problem, very challenging. And that's why there is still research dollars being invested in this. It is not just a question of, are we able to match this against 1,000 or 1,000,000 identity database? The question is, can we even process the image on the left in order to perform a matching operation? Or will a very smart defense attorney stand up in a court of law and question what processes were used to enhance the image in order to convict their client? So there are all these other aspects of biometrics that tend to be important because it's not simply matching images, it is the consequence of what happens after we match these images. What is the implication to individuals? And what are the processes that were used to make those matches? And are those processes reproducible? And are they acceptable? Or can someone poke a hole and say that particular processing would have forcibly matched my client with the incorrect identity? So you have all these questions floating around even for biometric problems. And often we get presented with pictures like this and someone asks, is this really a photograph of Abraham Lincoln? And if you were to be able to answer this question, you would carve out the image or here the person of interest, and you expect to have a matching image. And then you try to compare these two images. Not easy, because the image on the left, or rather the image on the top, has a very different composition than the image on the bottom. And so we call this heterogeneous biometrics, because biometric data does not offer itself in the same form and shape every single time. The image formation models for the image on the upper right is different from the one on the lower right? How do we account for those changes that can impact our decision policy? Or someone sends us a tape and asks us, is this really Elvis Presley's voice? Now, how many of us think Elvis Presley is no more? Okay, all right. That's a good start. As you know, some people believe that he's still alive, right? So they send us tapes like this, and we listen to it.
Elvis Presley died here about 3:30 this afternoon. Was brought to the hospital by ambulance. Efforts to revive him in the ambulance and efforts to revive him here at the hospital were unsuccessful.
But you know my name. Yep.
Okay. The question here, though, how many of you have heard that song? Okay, so you know what that song is, right? Okay. Because things have changed since 2003. The first time I asked the question, everyone in the classroom raised their hand. In 2018, when I asked the question, only 2 people raised their hands. So we know that song was written by, Will Jennings and Eric Clapton, right? Clearly after Elvis Presley died. But many people claim that the voice they hear there is Elvis Presley. How do you prove or disprove that it is not Elvis Presley? In other words, how do you take 2 singing voices and determine if they are of the same person? Or how do you take a singing voice and match it with a voice where a person just is speaking normally? Or how do you take a whispering voice and match it with a singing voice? These are very hard problems in biometrics. They're not trivial problems at all. In this case, of course, the person who's singing, and you can Google this later, is Doug Church, who goes around and he performs as Elvis Presley, and people pay, just like people pay people who look like Elvis Presley and try to impersonate him in terms of their looks. He gets quite a number of dollars performing around the country as Elvis Presley. We also have these questions in many other spheres of applications. One is in the video industry, where you ask the question, find all video frames in which a certain character appears. So if you were given billions of videos, and you were asked the question, find every video frame in which Robin Williams appears. All right? How would you go about doing that? Because Robin Williams clearly is an actor, and in different videos, he would have acted out a different role, and so he may not look the same, and he might mask his voice, or he has to mask his voice, and so on and so forth. But still, it's the same person. This is Robin Williams. How do you recognize that person? And so in this case, find all video frames in which this character called Odette appears.
Speed. Make him understand.
And you can say, well, we can take face images,
I could break this spell.
or you can look at
I'd run to him today, and
you can look at the hair,
somehow he's on his
or you can
way
look at the
to
way the person walks, what we call as gait recognition,
Derek, you and I
or you can look at
meant to
the eyes, the shape of the eye, or you can even look at the iris of the eye, and clearly you can reflect upon the voice of the subject. In other words, there are these multiple modalities that can potentially be used in order to pick out all frames in which this character appears. But it's not easy, because the character may not be the one who's singing, because you have other people singing in the background and so on and so forth. So the main point here is that the problem of biometric recognition not only has many different applications, but in all these applications, it's a challenging problem. For all the situations that we described in the previous slides, there is some degree of challenge that is implicit in either the way the problem is described or in the task that has to be undertaken. And so now you have many different biometric traits. You see this panel of traits here with fingerprints, palm prints, iris, voice, signature on the upper panel. And then in the middle panel, you have face, DNA, conjunctival vasculature, the scleral pattern. And then you see ear, keyboard dynamics, And then in the lower panel, dental biometrics, gait recognition, you see hand geometry, vasculature patterns, and then you have ECG. So you see there are a plethora of traits that can be appropriated for the purpose of human recognition, but in each of these cases, we still have to answer those two fundamental questions. How distinct is the trait, and how permanent is that trait? And even for the most popular modalities, face, fingerprint, iris, and voice, these questions have not been reliably answered. And that is what makes this problem exciting. If you can bring in, as I said earlier, and I'm repeating myself, to bear biology and your understanding of signal processing, information theory, capacity, and also a clear understanding of computer vision techniques and learning from data, perhaps you can come up with a good number that can stand the test of time. But it's still a very difficult problem on the uniqueness and permanence of each of these biometric modalities. And what makes it even difficult, as I said in summary, is that you're not dealing with pure instances of biometric data. You're dealing with biometric data that is corrupted by noise. And now to suggest that the image on the left matches with an image on the right is akin to saying, I have a signal, which can be an image, that has been severely distorted, and somehow it matches with this other signal which is pure, but we don't often ask the question, has it been distorted enough that it can inadvertently start matching with someone else? In other words, can I modify my fingerprint ever so slightly that it begins to match with someone else? And that is the most difficult question to answer, because we often force a match when in reality we might have ended up corrupting the data so much that it could have matched with anyone else for that matter. So these are some of the resident challenges. But what are the components of a biometric system? And so what we would like to do here is to provide an understanding of how a biometric system works, mostly from the perspective of pattern recognition. You have a sensor which acquires the biometric data. You have a feature extractor which extracts a set of discriminative features from the data. You have a comparator, or what was formerly called as a matcher, to compare two sets of extracted features. And then, in some cases, you have a database that stores these features pertaining to multiple individuals. And this would be one way to condense a biometric system into simple parts, 4 simple modules: a sensor, a feature extractor, a matcher, and some storage database. And in many different cases, we can ask the question, which features are extracted from a biometric trait? In the case of fingerprints, if you look at your fingers, you can look carefully at it, and you will see that the ridges are happily chugging along, and then all of a sudden they stop abruptly in some places. In some other places, they bifurcate. And if you were to take those two-dimensional points where they end or bifurcate, you get a spatial map of minutia points. And that two-dimensional map of minutia points is believed to be reasonably unique across or for an individual. Or from iris, you can extract what is called as the iris code, not done by humans, but you subject it to an image processing exercise, including Gabor wavelets and so on, and then you do some extraction of FASR features, and then you binarize it, you get a code called as iris code. For face, now with the advent of deep learning, some of the best performing face matchers are utilizing what is called as deep learning features that are extracted from deep learning enterprises such as convolutional neural networks. Now, why am I listing these 3? Because in fingerprints, the extraction of features, in some sense, has been guided by what happened in the forensic community, where people looked at these minutia points in order to make a determination as to whether these points were good enough for matching. And so they trained machines to look for minutia points. In other words, humans guided the machines, coaxed the machines, if you will, to extract features that they thought were reliable, salient, unique, invariant, etc. But if you wander down to face, often we throw up our hands and say, well, we don't even fully understand how humans recognize each other with face images. So let's have the machine learn some features from scratch. So often we don't understand what the machine has learned, although now there is much work going on in order to help us understand what features are being extracted. But these are some of the features that are being extracted, ranging from those which are handcrafted to those which are fully machine-driven, data-driven, and are extracted by machine, and humans may or may not have a good understanding of what features are being extracted. Several biometric applications. I think most of you have a smartphone which has a fingerprint sensor in it or a face authenticator embedded. But there's also border control examples, refugee tracking for fingerprints, using fingerprints, healthcare, iris, so on and so forth. So there are many different biometric applications. But there are several challenges. This is where we say biometrics is under attack. Intra-user variations. The same person in different scenarios looking different. And what this means from a mathematical perspective is that if a point in high dimension denotes a face, then as the person expresses themselves differently in different images, this point tends to wander around. It no longer is situated at a single point in this algebraic space. In some cases, we don't even know if it's an algebraic space. In some cases, we do know it's an algebraic space, but it doesn't satisfy any of the locally Riemannian manifold properties, making it difficult for computational purposes. But the point is that point moves around. And this leads to problems because you have what is called as intra-user variations leading to false non-match because my own data does not match with itself when acquired at two different time instances. And then you have a different problem called as false match rate, where two different individuals are now incorrectly marked as a match. And this is best illustrated with twins, siblings, parent, child, and so on and so forth, where the biometric system can be confounded as to whether two images are the same subject or belong to the same subject, or if they are of different subjects. It's not easy for machines as well. And what this means is we have to look at features beyond what we are acquiring in order to be able to make that distinction between two individuals. Noise, as we said, can impact error rates. Both false match rates, where my noisy fingerprint can all of a sudden begin to match with George's fingerprint. That leads to false match rate. But also my own fingerprint does not match with another fingerprint that was acquired 2 days ago, leading to false non-match. So noise can be a confounding factor. Some people can't be enrolled in the system, and they perceive that as an attack, because now some other means has to be undertaken to recognize this individual. Aging is a problem, because how do you match face images across a spectrum of ages? And what kind of features and cues can you extract so that you can make this possible? It's a very difficult problem. Even now, in spite of all the aging models that exist, matching newer images with images that were acquired several years ago is not only because of aging, but because also of the quality of the image, which has substantially changed. It can induce a lot of problems for biometric systems. But there are other types of attacks that I want to briefly talk about. Before, I want to talk a little bit about privacy, and then I'll bring it to a close. Spoofing. Spoofing. Altering one's trait or creating a physical artifact in order to spoof another person's trait. You see, using makeup for faces, or creating a synthetic fingerprint of someone else's finger, and then utilizing that to launch an attack against a system. Or you see on the lower right, printed iris can often be used as a spoof in order to impersonate someone else. Or fake irises, and so on and so forth. So all these are realistic attacks because they have been demonstrated in the real world, where people have used these artifacts to defeat a biometric system. And one of the experiments we did and we demonstrated based on data that was already available on the web, is how cosmetics can be used to spoof another person's face image. And so you see on the left an image before makeup, and the subject is deliberately applying makeup in order to look like a target identity, which is on the extreme right. And what we demonstrated and showed recently was those applications of makeup can in fact lead to many algorithms being confounded and mistakenly indicating that there is a match. And there are many such examples that we used to illustrate this, and also did some large-scale analysis to demonstrate that the application of makeup can in fact confound a system to the point where it starts mismatching identities. Makeup can also be used to mask one's own identity, something that we also demonstrated, that the application of makeup, not for spoofing purposes, but what we call as an obfuscation or a presentation attack, where it can be used to make a person look so different that they may or may not be matched with their original face image, the one that was obtained during enrollment. So you have all these challenges, and in addition, fingerprint alteration. There are some who have tried to deliberately mutilate their fingerprints in order to evade law enforcement, using various methods, surgical alterations. Please don't try any of these things. Using acid, and many other ways in which they deliberately try to alter their trait, and also some innovative methods, what is called as the ZCut method. The image on the left is a fingerprint before the ZCut. The image on the right is after that person deliberately transplanted their fingerprint from one portion of their finger to another and switched that and created now a fingerprint that could not be matched, that cannot be matched with the image on the left. So these are problems that we have to deal with in the real world because, as I pointed out earlier, biometrics is not necessarily always done in a cooperative environment. It is sometimes done in an adversarial environment. When a person is trying to go to the ATM to get their money, they are likely to be very cooperative. But when a person is trying to evade being detected, they are now dealing with an adversarial situation where a person is doing everything possible and anything possible to circumvent being recognized. So what I'm going to do, since I'm almost running out of time, is go to the last part. I'm going to skip a number of slides and then talk a little bit about privacy. So you'll see me skip some slides, but if you need all the slides, I'll be glad to share that with you. So I want to apologize in advance as I skip some slides, but because I want to convey something about privacy and then offer a solution, and then I'll stop the lecture. So some of you must have seen this particular report from BBC, and the copyright rests with BBC. I'm going to take a few minutes to play this. It's a fascinating technology, but we're looking at the privacy aspects of this.
Well, let's see how long it takes you to find me. Thank you very much. Let's go.
我们可以追溯到说，出现每一张脸都可以对应说他的身份证，以及他所经过，比方说在过去一周，我们回溯他的行经路程，我们也做了像人和车的匹配，那同时在人上匹配还包括亲属关系匹配，然后是你经常接触人员之间匹配，就是当摄像机布到或者我们传感器布到一定密度的时候，其实我们会经常知道你跟谁经常在一起。
Well, here we are then. I've just got out of the car, close to the city centre, and for the purposes of this exercise, the plan is for me to start walking in the direction of the bus station. my image has already been flagged to the authorities as a suspect, and in theory, it should only be a matter of time.
It has been flagged and is now setting out.
So already on this bridge, I can see 1, 2, 3 CCTV cameras. Of course, there's no point hiding from them. Just keep on walking.
可以呢，不一定非要从门里头通过，他就站在。哎，对，就是这里，就是这里。不是看过了。安全通道。对，就是这里。
Uh-oh. Right behind me, you can see just over my left shoulder there. Hello, guys. I've been expecting you. Maybe these guys aren't in on the joke.
Right. So you can see the exercise took just 7 minutes. When there is a network of cameras trying to glean information from faces and then the ability to connect that face with a database, the process of recognition, you can see how quickly recognition can be accomplished, but also some of the consequences of privacy when it comes to this. Now, there are also ways in which this technology can be biased. And I'm going to take a moment to show this because for those of you who are working in machine learning, we put a lot of premium on the training data that we use to train our algorithms. But if that data itself has some bias, then it's likely that the system has learned the bias more than the concept that it has to learn. Is this a face or is it learning something else? So here is an example.
Hi, I'm Joy, and I research how computers detect, recognize, and classify people's faces. In my TED featured talk, I spoke about my experience with the coded gaze, my term for algorithmic bias. The system I was using worked well on my lighter-skinned friend's face, but when it came to detecting my face, it didn't do so well, until I put on a white mask. After my talk was posted, I tested.
So I won't go into the full thing. It's a paper called Gender Shades by Job Alumni. And what she really points out is the fact that the training data could have some implicit bias that results in algorithms breaking down, but which society, therefore, incorrectly perceives as a deliberately staged bias. And this is where the technology, when it's put in the field, is under attack because not many people clearly understand the algorithmic basis for these technologies. But they're very quick to point out that when the algorithm fails, that perhaps there is a bias, and maybe that bias was intended against them. And often we spend much time trying to both communicate that that was not the intention, but also then to demonstrate that when those biases in the training data are removed, that the algorithm can potentially work as intended. And this falls upon every researcher in the sense that we have to understand what happens when these systems fail, because failure cases can give us more indication of what's going on in the algorithm than the cases where it succeeds. And if you look at the technology of face recognition and faces in general, some of you must have heard of this application, Face to Gene. And what this does, this particular app, you can download it, it takes a picture of a face and tries to determine if there are any genomic issues with that person, any genetic defects. That's why it's called as Face to Gene. And the code that you have there is from the chief of the Division of Medical Genetics in Delaware, in a hospital in Delaware, who had been seeing the patient for years, and they could not find out the problem. But someone used this app and said, this is the genetic problem for this particular symptom. And so he says, what had taken patient number 2's doctor 16 years to find took Face to Gene just a few minutes. And so where I'm going with this is that the face information offers much more information than just recognition. Age, gender, etc., but also, in this case, health cues. This is where a problem lies. Because in many cases, we wish for the algorithm to work like this, to be able to extract pieces of information that we thought could not be gleaned from face. But in many other cases, one could view that as being a potential privacy violation, a compromise of privacy. And so I can give you many examples. But with much data being tweeted, with much data being uploaded on the web, when all these data points are connected, it gives a profile of an individual that divulges more information than what was intended, a process called as data accretion. A singular source of data may not reveal much, but when it's connected with other sources of data pertaining to the same individual, then all of a sudden there is information leakage because of data accretion. This is a formidable problem for various reasons. But I want to point out that biometrics does not explicitly elicit identity. If I were to give a fingerprint, that fingerprint is not going to speak up and say, this belongs to Jane Doe. It does not. It's just a fingerprint. What makes it possible for us to associate an identity with this fingerprint is when you have a reference fingerprint labeled as Jane Doe, and if the image on the top matches with the image at the bottom, then you can say that the image on the top belongs to Jane Doe. So you have deduced that because you had two images, one which was labeled and one, of course, which was not labeled. Biometrics does not elicit identity. It merely tells us that the image at the top matches with the image at the bottom. The identity is provided by someone else, something else, some other application. Biometrics did not label this as Jane Doe. Maybe some user did. So the point here is biometrics, the purview of biometrics is only for recognition, saying that, well, I've seen this fingerprint before. Anything beyond that is external to biometrics. That doesn't really say that biometrics is not at fault or at fault. All that it says is the purview of biometrics is only to recognize. Everything else is additional. And so if you took the image at the bottom and labeled that as James Bond, then the image at the top belongs to James Bond. So you have this disparity between biometrics and what is not biometrics, identity versus recognition. I think we have 5 more minutes and then I'll close. Is that okay, Jordan?
Sure.
Okay. Is that okay? I'm sorry. Is everyone still awake? It's close to 4:30 Friday. Okay, all right. I'll just take 5 more minutes. What I'd like to talk about is this whole notion of privacy and having some control over the data that we provide for various purposes. So I'm skipping some slides, and I'm going to talk about this last thing, and then I'll bring this to a close. So one of the things that we would like to do is differential privacy. Okay, so you have an image on the left, it could be your photograph, and you want to upload it, or not upload it. You want to give this to a vendor because they're going to use that for face recognition. How much control do you have over your data? Is it possible for you to have sliders like this, the one that you see at the bottom of this view graph, where you can say, well, change my age, change my gender, and so on and so forth, but don't change my identity. In other words, I should still be recognizable by the matcher, again, algorithm, by the machine, but no other piece of information should be gleaned from my face image. In other words, can we change the face image such that you can still use it to match people, match faces, but you cannot use it to extract any other piece of information. You suppress gender information, suppress age information, etc. So what we did was we created a neural network architecture, and I'll show you some results. I won't go into the details of this neural network architecture. It's called as an autoencoder. What it takes is an input image, and then it produces an output image. Nothing strange there. But the output image is slightly perturbed. The autoencoder, the neural network, has learned how to perturb the output image such that you can still use it for recognition purposes, and hence there is a green check mark against identity. But you can't use it for extracting any other piece of information, and hence you have a cross for gender. So the design of the network itself and the training of the network is described in our paper. It's called as a semi-adversarial network. We call it a semi-adversarial network, SAN. Why is it semi-adversarial? Because it allows one matcher to work, namely the face recognition matcher. It does not allow another classifier to work, namely gender classifier. So it's semi-adversarial, not fully adversarial, it's semi-adversarial. So it's a convolutional autoencoder that we developed. And what it does, and there are ways in which we can train this, it produces images like this. You take the images at the top, and it transforms it and produces images that you see in the lower row. And what you're seeing here at the top is the original label that was assigned by an automated gender classifier. So we still haven't really tested this with humans, which is our next step. But you have on the upper row the label and the confidence on that label. So for example, the second subject, female, and the system says 98% confidence. In the lower row, you see the transformed image as transformed by a convolutional autoencoder. It did not have a visualistic realism term, which we have incorporated subsequently, but this is just to show that the image has changed as far as the label is concerned. However, the matcher, believe it or not, can successfully match the image at the top with its corresponding image at the bottom. In other words, you have retained the ability to recognize that individual with respect to the automated system, but the data has been modified so that the gender classifier is either confounded or it is perturbed, or in some cases neutralized. In other words, it just gives a neutral value as the gender. And so we have tested this. In some cases, the label does not change, as you will see in the next view graph. In some cases, the label may not change, but the confidence of that label changes. So there is perturbation that this network has learned during its training process on how to modify the image so that one set of classifiers are confounded, whereas another set of classifiers retain their utility. And this is what we call as differential privacy. And our experiments suggest that this type of perturbation can be helpful in retaining the utility of the data that you supply to someone else, but suppresses the ability to extract information beyond what was intended. So there are many things we can talk about privacy, but let me try to summarize it in a few words. Biometric systems depend upon the ability to compare two biometric samples. And often that process itself is heavily challenged in poor quality data. There are algorithms that can enhance the data, but in doing so, the question remains in the legal sphere as to whether you have modified an image to the extent that it actually looks like someone else and you have forcibly matched it with the target identity. So that's a challenge. Secondly, although biometric recognition requires two images to match, with a single image, as we said earlier, you can glean additional pieces of information with a single image. And the question is, how can you modify that singular image such that it can be used for one purpose and can be neutralized for its use in other purposes? And why is that important? Because then, when you supply your data, you have the ability to modify your data, or the third party has the ability to modify your data, so that there is some assurance of privacy that was previously not possible. That still leaves us with the open-ended question. There is no privacy metric that can be used for this purpose, and there is a need to quantify privacy. But privacy is a moving target. What constitutes as violating someone's privacy today may be viewed differently tomorrow and vice versa. And that's why the problem is challenging. But if there is a flexible technological way of handling the problem of privacy, then all the legislative constructs that are created after that will only serve to enhance the notion of privacy as far as biometric data is concerned. I have much more to say. I've run out of time. I really appreciate your patience. For those of you who fell asleep, it's time to wake up. But if there are opportunities to ask questions, I think that'll be great. But I'm going to be around for definitely until 5. Thank you very much.